All right, let's dive into one of the most fascinating topics in human biology. Today, we're going to peel back all the cultural layers and look at this straight-up science of the female orgasm, the anatomy, what's happening in the brain, and where it even came from, evolutionarily speaking. So, let's get into it.
I mean, think about it. This is a pretty universal human experience, right? But for some reason, it's still wrapped up in all this mystery. And that gap between how common it is and how little it's really understood is exactly what makes the science behind it so compelling. So, where does this story even begin?
Well, it has to start with the body itself, with the physical structures. For way too long, our understanding was pretty limited, and that created this whole myth of different types of orgasms. But modern anatomy, it gives us a much more complete and, honestly, a way more accurate picture.
And this was the big one, the question that dominated the conversation for like 100 years. This idea of two separate, almost competing kinds of orgasm. But what does the science actually say about this supposed debate? Well, the answer from all the modern studies is crystal clear. It was never a real debate in the first place. That whole distinction is just a leftover from when we didn't have the full picture. The reality is, it's all one complex, interconnected system.
So, the key term you gotta know is this: the clitoral urethral vaginal complex, or CUV complex for short. See, it's not about separate parts. It's about how the clitoris, the urethra, and the outer part of the vagina all work together as one big unified zone.
And this slide just makes it so clear. The clitoris isn't just what you can see. It's like an iceberg. That visible part, the glands, that's only about a fifth of the entire thing. Internally, its roots and bulbs go on for over 7 centimeters, and they wrap around the urethra and lie right up against the front wall of the vagina. And that's the aha moment. Stimulation inside the vagina is stimulating the internal parts of this huge clitoral complex. The so-called G-spot isn't some magic button, it's just part of this incredible unified anatomy. Okay, so that's the hardware. Now let's talk about the software, the actual experience. What is happening in the body, and more importantly, in the brain at that moment of peak pleasure? So physically, the climax is basically a series of really fast, involuntary contractions of the pelvic floor muscles. On average, you're looking at about 7 or 8 of them, one right after the other. But the real command center for all this, well, it's not in the pelvis, it's upstairs, in the brain. You know, there's this old myth that to have an orgasm, you have to turn your brain off. But neuroscience, especially with fMRI studies, shows us the exact opposite is true. The brain doesn't go quiet. It basically erupts in a symphony of activity. And the sheer amount of the brain that gets involved is just staggering. It's not one little pleasure spot that turns on. It's a whole brain event. Your sensory and motor areas are firing. The reward centers are going wild. Even the parts of your brain for high-level thinking and emotion, they all light up at the same time. And hey, don't just take my word for it. This quote from a major study in the Journal of Sexual Medicine pretty much says it all. The researchers found brain activity just builds and builds, peaks, and then comes back down. There was no shutting down, no deactivation, just a huge crescendo of neural fireworks. But okay, the story gets even more incredible when you start asking, how do those signals even get to the brain? For the longest time, everyone just assumed they traveled up the spinal cord. But then, a totally groundbreaking discovery revealed another path, a kind of neural superhighway nobody knew was there. Get this, it's the vagus nerve. It is a direct line from the cervix and uterus straight to the brainstem that completely bypasses the spinal cord. And they figured this out by studying women with complete spinal cord injuries. Even with no feeling below the injury, they could still feel stimulation and achieve orgasm. It's just proof that this alternate pathway exists. It's absolutely remarkable, like the body built in a backup system to make sure the signals get through. So after all those neural fireworks die down, the brain releases this flood of powerful hormones, and these chemicals are what shape that feeling of contentment and well-being, what people call the afterglow. The two main players in this chemical cocktail are oxytocin and prolactin. Oxytocin, you've probably heard of it, it's the bonding hormone. It makes you feel relaxed, content, and can even relieve pain. Prolactin is more of a satisfaction hormone. It's tied to that feeling of satiation. And what's really fascinating is that its surge is probably a leftover from an ancient reflex that used to trigger ovulation. Which brings us to our final and maybe most profound question. So if we zoom the camera all the way out, way out, to the grand scale of evolutionary history, where did this whole complex reflex come from in the first place? What was its original job? Right, this is the big puzzle. In modern humans, an orgasm isn't required for conception. So from a purely reproductive view, it seems like a fantastic bonus, as one scientist put it. But a really compelling theory suggests it wasn't always just a bonus. It used to be essential. To really get this, we have to look at two different ways that mammals ovulate. The older ancestral method is called induced ovulation. You see this in animals like rabbits and cats. For them, the act of mating triggers a hormonal surge, the exact same kind of surge we see in orgasm that is absolutely required to release an egg. The other method, which evolved later, is spontaneous ovulation, which is what we have. It just happens on a regular cycle, no matter what.
So, the evolutionary story seems to go something like this. Step 1. In our really distant ancestors, the orgasm reflex wasn't about pleasure, it was the on switch for ovulation. The clitoris was positioned right inside the vagina to make sure it got stimulated. Step 2. Spontaneous ovulation evolves, so that reflex isn't needed for reproduction anymore. Step 3. The clitoris actually moves to its external position. And finally, step 4. The reflex itself doesn't just vanish. It sticks around as an evolutionary echo, now free to take on new jobs, like pleasure and social bonding.
So even though its original reproductive job is kind of finished, that reflex has been repurposed for pleasure and bonding. But it turns out there's one more surprising benefit, one that has huge implications for our lifelong health. Remember those 7 or 8 muscle contractions? Well, they're basically a workout for your pelvic floor. And having a strong pelvic floor is absolutely critical for your posture. There's this brilliant analogy that compares them to the tension chains in a Gothic arch. These muscles manage all the forces coming down your spine and through your pelvis. When they're strong, they prevent a ton of problems. When they're weak, it can lead to things like incontinence and even chronic pain in your back, hips, and knees. So orgasm acts as this powerful, pleasurable, natural way to keep these vital muscles in shape for your entire life.
So when you put it all together, from the intricate anatomy to the symphony in the brain and the deep, deep echoes of our evolutionary past, it's so clear that the female orgasm is way more than just a fleeting moment of pleasure. It is a profoundly integrated, whole-body phenomenon. It started out as a key for reproduction, and since then, it's been adapted for pleasure, for bonding, for structural health, which kind of leaves us with a final, really cool thought. If this ancient reflex has already proven to be so adaptable, what other roles in our health and our well-being might we discover it plays in the future? Thanks for watching.